Yeah, it's a fictitious layout. I'm very interested in the West Highland line. The layout itself took 10 months. I will confess that the layout's born out of a failed project. I'm a member of Scarborough District Railway Modellers. The modellers bought the baseboards, and the original intention, believe it or not, was to build Kyle of Loch House. We have a track plan, an indication as to which way the points are facing. Being a shed layout, the locomotives can more or less freely and slowly move about as the drivers wish. I'm responsible for the scenery and the buildings on the layout, which the shed building is scratch built. Brickwork, I tend to stick the bricks on individually. If the roof tiles, I tend to stick those on individually as well. Not as time consuming as you would think. Very therapeutic and relaxing. The sound is all by Lego Man before. He's developed sound files for the West Highland Class 37s, particular favourite of mine. The 37s and indeed all the locomotives are fitted with his sound chips.
Being a club layout, we try to involve a number of people, a number of members when we build any new layout. And here we wanted to pull together bits we'd learnt over past layouts. So we decided to go for Marsway points and SNP track, as we thought it looks more prototypical than anything else on the market at the moment. So we decided to do that, and we also went for slow motion point motors rather than the solenoid snap ones. Once again, a little bit more prototypical. So that's the way we went. I think the trickiest thing for me was getting to grips with the new technology. I remembered the old analog days, you just twist the knob and the loco moved away, whereas now with digital there's a little bit more to get your head around, but it was definitely worth the effort, because what you can get from DCC as opposed to analog now has awakened the hobby. I think the days have gone where we used to have a white piece of board and we used to draw on it with a felt tip pen and stick our switches on it. So the club was lucky enough to find a local guy who does graphic design. He saw what we were trying to do and said, let me have a go and I'll draw it for you in software, and you've seen the results. It's staggering. It completely brings the layout to life. This is a club layout, as we mentioned before, and that means it's going to be operated by more than one person at any one time. So having a panel that is really crystal clear as to where the points are, where the locos are going to be, helps them when they're setting their routes. If you're wiring your layout, you'll remember tomorrow what you did today, but next week you might just forget. So it's always a good idea to label your wires. If you've got different colours, do yourself a wiring protocol and stick to it. So that's something for wiring. Sound, I think sound is, that's the exciting part of the hobby at the moment. It's moving forward week by week. There's advances in the technology and what's now available to customers. It's a personal thing, sound, of course. So a loco that you remember from your youth, have a listen to all the different sound files that all your suppliers can now provide, and see which one you think that's what you remember. At the end of the day, it's personal, isn't it? But there are so many choices out there now. Don't just accept what's offered straight away. Shop around. I'm a fairly late returner to the hobby. I had a train set when I was a boy, but when I was 13 we moved house and there's no more room for that. And then after I retired, a family member was given a train set as an anniversary present, and as they say, everything just started from there.
In this month's BRM, we're talking a lot about DCC and wiring, and essential components of any model railway. But I know a lot of people are quite nervous about the electrical side of model making. Well, hopefully I'm going to demystify a few little pieces of the wiring conundrum, so that when you go away and wire your layout and then write it up for BRM in the future, you won't say, oh, this electrical stuff scares me. Here's a few basic techniques for working with wire, and they'll work just as well for DC and DCC users, because at some point you're always going to have to attach one wire to another or one wire to something else. And that means you're going to need a soldering iron. I'm using an 18-watt Antex soldering iron. It's mains powered and it's just the right size for the job. You don't need anything that's bigger because you're not looking to heat up your house, and you don't want anything too tiny because you want the solder to heat up and run nice and fluidly. The soldering iron itself is not a particularly exciting tool. Electricity comes in at one end, there's a plastic handle that doesn't get hot, and all the business end is up this end, and that is where it gets very nice and toasty, so don't touch it. Trust me, we all have, and we all learnt the hard way. I would recommend you get a soldering iron stand. Basically this allows you to put the hot end in somewhere that gives it a bit of protection. It also keeps the hot end hot, because there's nothing, you're not sat on anything to suck the heat out of it. It'll come with a handy little sponge in the base, and you should use the sponge just to clean the tip of the soldering iron pretty much continuously as you're working. If you haven't got lumps of molten solder stuck on the tip, your work will be a lot neater, and quite frankly, we're often working underneath baseboards. It's less solder to drip onto you when you're working down there. Talking of solder, I'm using electrical solder. This is a 60-40 tin lead mix with a core of flux running down the centre of it. The flux is effectively a lubricant and it helps the solder run along the wires. You can get what they call lead-free solder. It works. I've used it, it's fine, but you do need a little bit more heat in there. Certainly if you're beginning, 60-40 leaded solder available through most model railway traders and a lot of electrical stores is absolutely fine. And there's 20 grams in here, and I reckon that would do most of a layout. Right, let's get started with the first important feature, and that is the absolute simplest of jobs: tinning some wire. The wire I'm using is just about 2mm thick. It's the same stuff that you can see on a lot of model railway traders stores for layout wiring. You do not need great big thick cables under layouts, possibly with the exception of a DCC bus system where you want something a little larger, but don't lose too much sleep over voltage drop or anything like that unless you've got a particularly large layout, at which point you probably want to find somebody who's done a bit of wiring in the past. For most people, thin wire like this will be absolutely fine. You can use you can use pretty much any cheap wire. There's nothing special about it. This stuff, if I strip the ends, there we are, I've just taken the insulation off. You've got strands of wire running down the centre. Twist them so that they're nice and neat. Stops them splaying out if you have to poke them into anything. And then the next stage is I like to tin the wire, literally give it a coat of solder. Now, as with a lot of wiring jobs, you wish you'd grown 3 hands, but by carefully bending my solder, I can stick it up in the air, touch the wire against the solder, and then electrical soldering, you should always try and bring the heat to the joint. There we go, you can see the flux is doing its job. Solder spread nicely along the wire. Little blow, just to cool it off a bit. That isn't going to unravel, it's nice and neat, and even if you were to put it into a screw block or a chocolate block or whatever, it would just give you a nice good connection. The next stage though is probably joining a couple of wires up. Here's a wire I prepared earlier. In this case I've just stuck it on top of a bottle for convenience, but you'll get the idea. Because I've tinned the end of this wire, joining these two is going to be fairly simple. Ideally the exposed lengths want to be about the same size. Pick up a little bit of solder on the end at the tip of the iron. Don't need a great big ball of it because both are tinned already, so when you heat this up the solder you've already got on there will melt. And there we are. Give the joint a really good tug. If it doesn't break, then it's probably going to be great in service, and that means one less thing to worry about. You're not going to be crawling around underneath the layout looking for a broken joint in a hurry. Being methodical is really important when you're wiring. Make sure every one of the joints is good, and therefore, hopefully, when you take the layout to a show or when you're just operating at home, you can crack on with operating the railway and not spend all your time poking around trying to work out why the electricity isn't working. It's important to cover that joint because wires floating around that are uncovered can touch metal things and short circuit. The obvious way to do it is just to wrap a bit of insulating tape around the joint, and that will work perfectly fine. But a slightly neater option is to use what we call heat shrink tubing. Now heat shrink tubing is available in lots of different colours. This one's red, but there's loads and loads of colours out there and allows you to colour code it underneath your layout should you feel a need. It's got slight magical properties, this tubing. As you can see, it's already quite fat, but if I heat it up, it'll get smaller. Now I'm going to use a piece of clear heat shrink tubing here, just so that you can actually see what's going on inside. I'll just slide it over the joint, and as you can see, it's rattling around over that joint. That's not staying anywhere. It isn't until you warm the tube up. I use the tip of a soldering iron. There are specialised tools, but quite frankly I'm too stingy to buy one, and I've always got a soldering iron handy. Just rub the hot bit of the soldering iron back and forth along the tube, and amazingly it does exactly what it says. As it heats up, it shrinks, and should quickly shrink to the size so it's really gripping the wire both sides of the joint. And not only is it supporting the joint, because if that solder joint wasn't very good, you'd actually find that the heat shrink tubing would hold the two bits of wire together and probably keep your electrical connection going. It's also waterproof. I know this because I build radio control model boats, and water can get into the boat, but it doesn't get into the electrics, and that's a really useful thing. You can also use this heat shrink tubing over things like connections to point motors and other things, but we'll come to the point motors next. One of the jobs you're probably going to have to do under your layout is wire stuff to point motors. This is a perfectly standard Pico point motor, and as you can see, there are electrical connections that need to be made on the side. Now, these little tags are designed to be soldered to. You can occasionally get some clips that will go over the top of them, but soldering is the way these are designed to work. And they are really quite simple. Poke the wire through the hole. Having holes in them makes a real benefit. You can solder directly to the tags, but this way, look, the thing's all supported. I don't need 3 hands. Again, put the solder on the joint, a little bit of heat, and you can see solder runs nicely over there. Again, give the joint a good tug. If it doesn't come off, the chances are it's a good one. If it comes off, it wasn't very good, it would have given you grief in the future. You can just snip the wire. It's not a bad idea just to snip the wire. Just snip the wire and just take a little bit of the excess off. It's not essential, and you could put again heat shrink tubing over that joint just to really give it a sort of belt and braces effect. One job we're all going to have to do is fit wires to the track on our layouts. You can use track clips or other devices, but they tend to be a bit bulky, and if I'm honest, they tend not to be that reliable either. Soldering should offer you a good, reliable, solid joint that you can forget about it. I've certainly got soldered joints on layouts that have lasted 25 years, so if I can get away with it, then pretty much anybody can. The track on my little test piece here, I've drilled some holes already for the wires to go through under the baseboard. The track is weathered. Now, one thing solder does not like is it does not like sticking to dirty metal. You need to make sure that every bit of metal you're soldering to is absolutely scrupulously clean, and then the solder will flow nicely. So because I have already weathered the track, what I'm going to use a fiberglass pencil. You could use a bit of fine emery cloth to do this job. I'm just going to clean the paint off the side of the rails. It takes a little bit of a scrub. There we go. Little bit of a polish there. And that's now ready for soldering. Always tin the joint first. Again, just put the solder into the side of the rail, bit of heat, and there we go. That's tinned. Take your piece of wire and again tin the wire. There are a couple of good reasons for this. The first is that when we bring the two together, the solder will flow between the two of them really easily. But to be honest, when you're crawling around under a layout, the most important reason is that the wires will stay nice and tightly bundled up. So when you poke them through the hole in the baseboard, you don't have to force them because they've decided to turn into an umbrella shape in the middle of the wood. There we are. Again, I should be able to get away with a little bit of solder picked up on the tip of the iron. Hold the two together. And there we go. You might wonder if I'm burning my fingers here. As long as you're in and out fairly quickly, you'll be surprised how long you can hold on to the insulation. If you're concerned, well, hold it in place with a pair of tweezers or a bit of blue tack. But anyway, pull the wire through the hole, and as you can see, the joint is almost invisible. A touch of paint, a little bit of ballast, and that's going to disappear. And best of all, good tug on the joint. I can be confident that's going to give me many years good service. All this is all very good, and I'm probably guessing that you're sitting there going, yeah, well, it's easy for you, Phil. You've done loads of this sort of thing. What happens to me? I'm bodging away. What happens when it goes wrong? Well, it does go wrong for me as well. Sometimes I need to undo soldered joints, and for that, I need a solder sucker. This is a fairly modern one, bought relatively recently at a show, costs about £6 or £7, and is essentially a sprung-loaded syringe. You push the plunger down, and then you poke the nozzle, which is reasonably heat-proof, into your solder, press the button, and the plunger goes back up and sucks the excess solder away. These things have been around for a long while. I think this slightly comedy giant-sized version, for people like me who make lots of mistakes, I think this one probably dates from the 1970s. But it works in exactly the same way. Arm it, press the button, and it sucks the solder up. So if I take my point motor here, I've decided I want to detach the wire. What I do, heat the joint up. That's it, solder's running nicely. Suck the solder away, and there we are. The wire's clear. So today we've covered soldering and unsoldering. As I say, it's not too scary. Just remember, that end of the soldering iron gets hot. That end's the bit to hang on to. Trust me, I've been there. And work carefully, work methodically, and you'll be amazed how reliable your electrical wiring will be. How do you buy wire for your model railway? Do you buy it in handy little spools? Well, that's great for us as modelers, but the real railway buys wires in great long lengths, and they usually come attached to a wooden cable drum. That means that there are cable drums littering the real railway, and they've been around for well over 100 years. Certainly Victorian tramways would have been home to many, many of these things. So we're going to need to look at cable drums. There are lots and lots of options. In 4mm, there are certainly things like the classic Airfix kit that's been around since the 1960s. There are various manufacturers who will make all sorts of castings. And moving up a scale to 7mm, we have the advantage that we've got these rather nice little kits from Skytrex, made up of a pair of ends cast in white metal and the inner core, which is cast in resin. You can actually see the planks on it. The great thing about this kit is that we can actually display it empty, or we can wind cable around it so that we've got a full drum. Dealing with white metal castings isn't a problem. You can see they're quite soft, so they will bend easily. You have to be a little bit careful with them. And the first job with any white metal casting is just to check for flash and mould marks on the outside. There's not a lot here, but the trick with it is ideally use an abrasive, or actually I prefer just scraping along the edges that I need to clean up with a knife. This is a military modeller's technique. They use it for sharpening swords on white metal figures. And if you scrape along the edges of your casting, it just cleans it up. The problem with white metal is, being a very, very soft metal, it will clog files. So you either have to use quite a coarse file or an abrasive, or I believe you can scatter French chalk onto the file as well, and that'll help keep it clean. Me, I tend to use a coarse file, or I'll actually prefer to use just scraping away with a knife. It's certainly a technique I've used many, many times just for sharpening corners. Anyway, you can see a little bit of white metal swarf there. We'll get rid of that. Make sure our ends are nice and flat, and then take a quick look at the core. The core itself has a hole in one end that will go over the dimple on the casting, but it's not got a hole in the other end. So my first job is actually just to, and I'm doing this by eye, I must admit, I should really measure out and do everything like that properly, but I'm just going to pop a hole in the other end to match up with the dimple. Doesn't have to be very deep. Don't use a power tool for this sort of thing. You will just drill an enormous hole. It's the job really for a pin vise and a smallish drill bit. The ideal glue for most white metal modelling tends to be super glue of some sort. This is a Deluxe Materials Odour Free that I'm trying out here. And just a little bit of that around there. If you're doing very delicate work, what I would recommend is put the glue onto a piece of plastic and pick it up with the end of a pin or a tiny screwdriver. It just stops you getting too much glue into the joint. And there we are. We've assembled our cable drum. That's nice. And actually, white metal isn't a bad colour to work with for wood, because most people tend to assume wood is brown, and the truth is that if you look at it closely, it's very often a sort of silvery grey colour. Certainly once it's been outside a little while, it will fade to grey, even if it's had a bit of wood preservative on. And the truth is, cable drums didn't get an awful lot of wood preservative. They went silver and they went dirty. So what I've done is I've painted this handy cable drum. Yeah, I have only fitted one end. It just makes it easier to hold to the camera. I've painted it with a mix of some grey paints I happen to have lying around, silver grey and Humbrol 111. What I've done is just painted one over the other and let them mix onto the model, so I get a slightly less than even effect. And that actually looks that's actually looking quite nice. But I do need to pick out the ironwork. Now, cable drums are heavy, and you get these big hefty ironwork where you've got a central core where a pole can be put through and the whole cable drum lifted up on the pole. And what you would find is those are put onto special bits on the backs of wagons where the drum can unwind. I mean, this is essentially like a great big bobbin of thread. The drum will be able to unwind, but it has to be supported on something, hence the enormous ironwork. And that, being metal, will start to go rusty. Now, I could use paint for this, but actually I'm going to use weathering powders. Weathering powders are essentially a sort of crushed, they're essentially a sort of crushed artist's pastel, and they do differ a little bit. So do try different types and see which ones work best for you. The Humbrol ones come in quite a nice little pot here, little glass pot. And I've got two different colours that both claim they're rust. Now rust, as any old car owner will know, comes in very many different colours and textures, from quite a pale orangey colour here for new rust, to the darker colours such as this older rust here, to even almost a purple colour. Now, all I'm doing is I'm applying this dry. There's no need to wet the surface or put varnish or anything on. Generally, if you're using a matte paint, the weathering powder will stick quite nicely. And I'm just going to brush this over the surface, and you can see it's picking up quite nicely on the ironwork. But I'm not too worried. I'm going to get it on the wood as well, because again, a bit of dirt always looks good. The rusty areas will tend to spread, and you can see that I'm starting to get a bit of colour into that one there. And so weathering powder is great fun. Don't be scared of mixing them up a little bit. Let's have a bit of the other colour on there, and I'm going to go over with the lighter colour, just go over the whole thing, so that we're starting to get some real discoloration. Part of this, bear in mind where your model is set. If you're set, for example, in a very china clay area, you'll be looking at some very light colours. This is a much more general colour, this sort of orangey colour, and just mix them up on the model. So you can see the dark, I'm just getting a bit of the dark onto the ironwork. And there we are, it's starting to come together. Now this is a fairly simple job, and I'm going to drop it into the layout at some point, and I will probably weather around it a little bit more. But there you are, that's a very quick thing. However, there is one really important thing to know about cable drums. And I built a layout called the Hellingly Hospital Railway, based on an asylum railway on the south coast, and it's got a tramway overhead, which is lovely. So I built a couple of cable drums for my model, and they looked very nice. I was very pleased with them. And I've got one sat on its end, and I thought I'll have one sat like that with somebody having their lunch sat on it. And I got told off. I got told off by a gentleman who pointed out that these things in real life are incredibly heavy. You do your level best not to let them end up like that, because getting them back upright is really hard work when they're full of wire. So on the layout, most of the time, these things are going to be sat on their edge with probably wrapped with cable. This is a wooden kit that we've just wrapped with some ordinary modelling electrical cable, and just tuck the end out there, because again, the end usually comes out at the end of the cable, just a cable drum to support it. But I say, on the layout, most of them, sit them like that, and you won't have old railwaymen come and shout at you.
Well, unfortunately, guys, that's all we've got time for in this episode of BRM TV. But stay tuned next month. We've got more great content headed your way. And if you've got a layout that you'd like featured on BRM TV, then please send us a video to the email address on screen below for a chance to win some goodies from the BRM cupboard. Anyway, from all of us here at BRM TV, till next issue, take care of yourselves and happy modelling.